December 19th, 2025, 4 a.m. Brussels. Inside the headquarters of the European Council, the air felt heavy. Cold coffee sat untouched on the tables, papers were scattered everywhere, and Europe's most powerful leaders had been arguing behind closed doors for nearly 19 hours. Outside, the world was waiting for one announcement. For months, headlines had promised the same thing. Europe was finally going to make Russia pay. Since the war in Ukraine began, the EU and its allies had frozen hundreds of billions of dollars linked to the Russian central bank. The idea sounded simple: use that money to fund Ukraine. Not European taxpayers. Not more public debt. Russia would pay for the war it started. At least that was the public story. But when the doors finally opened and exhausted leaders stepped into the cameras, everything had changed. There would be no direct seizure, no giant reparations fund, no dramatic moment where Europe forced Moscow to pay. Instead, the EU announced something far more familiar: debt. They would borrow the money themselves, adding billions more to Europe's balance sheet, money that would eventually be paid by European taxpayers. The real reason was far darker. Europe had realized that touching those frozen assets could trigger a financial war they might not survive. At the center of that fear was a company most people had never heard of: Euroclear. Euroclear is not a normal bank. It is the hidden plumbing of global finance, the system that helps move ownership of bonds, stocks, and sovereign debt across borders. It handles more than $37 trillion in assets. If Euroclear stops functioning, Europe's financial system feels the shock. And this is where the Russian money was sitting. Nearly $191 billion of frozen Russian assets were held in Belgium through Euroclear. These were not just piles of cash. They were bonds and securities. Some had matured, generating billions in interest. Brussels saw an opportunity. Maybe they didn't need to seize the principal. Maybe they could just use the profits. Take the extraordinary interest, use it to support Ukraine, and call it justice. It sounded perfect, until Moscow responded. Russia understood Europe's weak point wasn't politics. It was finance. A major legal claim was prepared against Euroclear. The message was simple: you are holding our money. You refuse to return it, and now you are responsible. The threat was massive. If Europe touched Russian assets, Russia could retaliate by seizing Western assets trapped inside Russia: banks, pension funds, investment firms, billions in capital. For Belgium, this was terrifying. The assets were in Belgium. Euroclear was Belgian. If retaliation came, Belgium would take the first hit while the rest of Europe enjoyed the political credit. So Belgium demanded guarantees. If Europe wanted to jump, everyone had to jump together. Germany, France, Italy. Everyone needed to share the risk. But that was where the room went silent. Talking about justice was easy. Signing a check for hundreds of billions in liability was not. Then came the ECB. The European Central Bank saw a bigger danger: trust in the euro itself. The euro survives because countries trust Europe's legal system. They trust that property rights matter. If Europe started seizing sovereign reserves, global central banks might begin moving away from euros, toward dollars, gold, or other safer options. That kind of capital flight could trigger inflation, rising borrowing costs, and serious damage across the eurozone. Funding Ukraine mattered, but protecting the euro was survival, and survival always wins. Italy had its own reasons to hesitate. Italian banks still had major exposure inside Russia. If retaliation came, it would not stop with Euroclear. European banks could become targets, and billions could disappear. National interest replaced political slogans. At the same time, Washington cast another shadow. Some voices in the incoming Trump administration reportedly viewed frozen Russian assets not as spending money, but as leverage for future peace talks. If the money was spent, it was gone forever. If it stayed frozen, it could be used later in negotiations. Europe did not want to move too aggressively while America's political direction was changing. By 4 a.m., the truth was obvious. The legal risks were too high. The financial risks were too high. The political risks were too high. So Europe chose the safest option: debt. They would issue bonds, borrow the money themselves, and leave taxpayers to carry the burden. It was expensive, but it protected Euroclear, protected the euro, and protected the financial system. To save face, the assets would remain frozen, not seized, not returned, just frozen indefinitely. a hostage nobody was willing to kill. The next morning, headlines celebrated unity and support for Ukraine. But beneath those headlines was a colder truth. Russia had shown that financial retaliation still worked. Europe had looked into the abyss of financial warfare and blinked. Because in the modern world, finance often controls politics, not the other way around. Leaders may speak about justice, but systems survive on trust, liquidity, and stability. In the end, Europe chose to protect the system over punishment. The war continued. The assets remained frozen. And as always, the bill was sent somewhere else, usually to taxpayers. Because wars may be fought with weapons, but they are almost always paid for with debt. But the story doesn't end there, because freezing the assets created a different kind of problem. Time. Frozen money is never truly inactive. Every month those reserves remain trapped. Political pressure inside Europe kept growing. Citizens were asking the same question again and again. If the money is already there, why are we paying instead? Why should families facing inflation, higher energy prices, and rising taxes carry the cost while billions linked to Russia simply sit untouched inside the system? That frustration became dangerous for European governments. Supporting Ukraine was still politically important, but public patience was not unlimited. Elections across Europe were approaching, and opposition parties began using the issue as a weapon. They argued that leaders were protecting financial institutions more than ordinary citizens. To many voters, it looked like Brussels was choosing banks over people.